History is unfolding right before our eyes. On June 9, 2024, the long-standing petrodollar agreement between Saudi Arabia and the U.S. expired, and Saudi Arabia announced that they would not be renewing the deal. So what? Just another economic maneuver, right? But this is actually a pivotal moment in the global economy that could change everything. What was the agreement about? 50 years ago, the U.S. offered Saudi Arabia a deal: sell oil exclusively in U.S. dollars in exchange for security, advanced weapons, and access to technology. The Saudis agreed, and in 1974, the famous Petrodollar Pact was signed. This formed the foundation of a system where oil could only be purchased by first acquiring U.S. dollars. By the way, what comes to mind when you hear the word currency? Most people likely think of the dollar, as it's become the global symbol of money. But this wasn't always the case. For example, between 1720 and 1815, the French livre served as the reserve currency, and from 1815 to 1920, it was the British pound sterling. So, the dominance of the dollar is the result of historical and economic events. In 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement tied the financial system to the dollar, not just gold. After World War II, the U.S. remained the only stable superpower with economic stability, exactly what war-torn countries needed. A common currency that satisfied everyone became essential for active trade. The U.S. banking system was also stable during this period, leading many countries to invest their wealth in dollars to protect against inflation. The largest holders of U.S. assets became Japan, China, and the UK. However, another factor was global energy control. In 1971, the U.S. decided to print money without a gold standard. Before this, the dollar was tied to gold, but the U.S. didn't have enough reserves to cover all printed money. If every dollar holder wanted to exchange their dollars for gold, the U.S. couldn't fulfill that. In 1965, French President Charles de Gaulle demanded to exchange $1.5 billion for gold at $35 per ounce, which equaled 165 tons of gold, nearly three-quarters of the U.S.'s gold reserves. The U.S. government couldn't meet such a request. Throughout the 1970s, the U.S. abandoned the gold standard, introducing a floating exchange rate and dollar supremacy. U.S. President Richard Nixon implemented reforms, essentially telling the world that no one could convert dollars into gold anymore. The U.S. economy faced stagnation and inflation, which led to international tensions, especially in Arab countries, who raised oil prices and imposed export embargoes. Unlinking the dollar from gold needed a replacement resource to maintain stability. This turned out to be black gold, or oil. This was a monumental move in the global economy. Just think about how important this agreement was. The petrodollar system, invented by Henry Kissinger and Nixon, allowed the U.S. to dominate global trade. Nixon sent his Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger to Saudi Arabia for a secret meeting on the USS Quincy. Few records of this meeting exist, but it's known that Nixon promised the Saudi king weapons and protection in exchange for an agreement to sell oil only in U.S. dollars. This meant that if countries wanted to trade the world's most important commodity, oil, they had to get U.S. dollars first. A brilliant scheme. From that moment, oil prices would be set in U.S. dollars, and this agreement between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia has helped the U.S. maintain the dollar as the global reserve currency for over 75 years. However, in 2024, Saudi Arabia announced it would not renew the agreement. This is alarming for the U.S., especially considering Saudi Arabia's involvement in China's central bank project to create a digital currency. Reuters reported that Saudi Arabia joined China's central bank project for a digital currency, which could be another step towards reducing the volume of global oil trade in U.S. dollars. The project has reached the minimum viable product, MVP, stage, meaning the technology is operational. This is significant because the Saudis are not the first to move away from dollars in international trade. China and Russia have almost entirely abandoned the dollar, conducting over 90% of their transactions in national currencies. For example, U.S. Congressman Thomas Massie mentioned in a Tucker Carlson podcast that before sanctions against Russia, 70% of their transactions were conducted in dollars, but now less than 20% of transactions use the American currency. Every time the U.S. imposes new economic sanctions, the world takes a step closer to de-dollarization. In this context, the BRICS alliance is launching its own payment system, BRICS Bridge, which promises to be a settlement infrastructure based on digital currencies and blockchain. This will ensure the security and anonymity of transactions, reducing the influence of other countries, especially the U.S. Saudi Arabia wants to join BRICS. While they are not officially part of the alliance yet, they are actively participating in meetings. According to Russia's deputy foreign minister, they are working alongside everyone else. BRICS has impressive goals. First, the alliance truly wants to reshape the global financial system to increase the influence of developing countries and improve their access to international financial institutions. It's clear that under the current dollar-based system, every country is under the control of the U.S. government, and this remains BRICS' biggest motivation. Creating an independent payment system is an incredibly important step for all members of the alliance. Secondly, BRICS countries continue to promote the idea of statehood for Palestine in its conflict with Israel. Look at the map. In green are the countries that recognize the Palestinian state. About 88% of the world's population lives in these green areas. Nearly all of these countries also support de-dollarization and the rise of BRICS. The war in Gaza has become the latest political issue dividing BRICS and the U.S. The U.S. will always support Israel, while BRICS will continue to advocate for Palestinian statehood. The third major point in BRICS' plans is to counter U.S. sanctions. All alliance ministers express unanimous frustration, arguing that unilateral Western sanctions are incompatible with the principles of the UN Charter and negatively impact economic growth, trade, energy, healthcare, and food security in many countries, especially developing ones. This is why the prospect of a multipolar world is becoming increasingly attractive to many nations. Most countries want economic freedom, which means freedom from the dominance of the US dollar. The US, of course, is already feeling the decline of its financial dominance. But is the American economy really only sustained by the demand for its currency? What is the real value of the US to the global economy? Let's compare. China is known as the world's factory. It produces and exports almost everything. Germany is famous for its engineering and high-quality manufacturing, like BMW, Porsche, and Mercedes. Japan is a major exporter of electronics and cars, such as Toyota and Honda, as well as top-tier anime. South Korea is renowned for its semiconductors, Samsung gadgets, Hyundai cars, and quality skincare products. Saudi Arabia is famous for its oil, being one of the largest crude oil exporters in the world. Russia is rich in natural resources like gas, oil, coal, and minerals. Brazil is known for its agriculture and is one of the largest exporters of soybeans, coffee, sugar, and beef. India is a major exporter of software and technology. Australia, rich in natural resources, is a leading exporter of iron ore, coal, natural gas, and black opals. Canada is a large exporter of natural resources, including timber and minerals. France is the largest exporter of luxury goods globally, alongside Italy with its Ferrari, Lamborghini, wine, and pasta. The Netherlands is famous for its flowers, dairy products, and vegetables. Switzerland is a leader in financial services, pharmaceuticals, and watchmaking. So what is the U.S. known for? Hollywood, candy bars, military equipment. In reality, many goods consumed worldwide are produced under American brands, including culture and technology. But perhaps the biggest export of the U.S. is U.S. dollars, and it is this that keeps the American economy afloat. If your currency is needed by everyone, your economy thrives. You see, the petrodollar system created global demand for other countries to buy U.S. dollars and treasury bonds, which fuels U.S. economic growth. This has also led to stability in the U.S. economy, lower interest rates, and liquidity in financial markets. But without the ability to export dollars, none of this would work. The U.S. economy is a lot like a balloon. Imagine the balloon deflated. That's the U.S. economy in its normal state. Every time a problem arises, the U.S. government pumps money into the economy, inevitably leading to inflation. If you keep pumping money, the balloon will eventually burst, and the economy will collapse because consumers won't be able to afford anything. So why hasn't this happened to America? Because they have this release valve, they let off the pressure by exporting dollars to the rest of the world, knowing that the world needs this currency to buy energy. This system works, but only as long as the valve functions properly. What happens if the world no longer needs such a large flow of dollars? Exactly, the balloon pops. Greece is on the verge of default, and today it's only hours away from what many consider almost inevitable. The UN reports that 4 out of 5 Syrians now live below the poverty line, with food prices tripling over the past year. Since 2019, the Lebanese pound has lost more than 90% of its value, and prices for essential commodities have nearly doubled. In February, Argentina's annual inflation rate exceeded 100% for the first time since 1991, reaching triple digits. As a result, expenses are rising, leading to small bank failures. But more notably, this situation is putting pressure on the federal budget, and people are paying higher taxes to cover these higher interest rates. If the dollar becomes less necessary for other countries, its value will drop, directly affecting the lives of Americans. With a cheap dollar, foreign goods and travel abroad will become much more expensive for Americans. Do you now understand why Saudi Arabia's decision is so crucial to the global economy? At the moment, the US dollar's position as a reserve currency has reached a historic low. So what is the essence of Saudi Arabia's refusal to extend the petrodollar agreement? How does the country plan to sustain its economy? This is where it gets interesting. Let me explain. The oil era is coming to an end, at least that's what the International Energy Agency believes. They predict we may reach peak oil demand sometime in the 2030s, possibly as early as 2028. But oil prices continue to rise. Do you know why? Because the oil era will never truly end. There's an entire industry that transforms black sludge into everything from plastic to clothing, from medicines to fertilizers, without which we wouldn't survive. All of this is made from oil, and this will continue for decades to come. Yet the world is adamantly trying to wean itself off oil. The EU and Japan have pledged that by 2035 all new car sales will be electric. And 2 global superpowers, America and China, are spending hundreds of billions of dollars on national renewable energy projects. And you can see why. You don't need to be a financial analyst to understand that in a couple of decades, we'll likely be using less oil than we do now. This is simply because oil is a finite resource, and many countries are preparing for this reality. For some, this is good news, but for Saudi Arabia's crown prince, it's a nightmare, or at the very least, a serious challenge. Why? Because Saudi Arabia is not just holy sites, deserts, and mosques. It's a country with a lot of oil. To be precise, an obscene amount. Saudi Arabia owns nearly a fifth of all proven oil reserves in the world. Unlike Venezuela, which actually has the largest reserves, Saudi oil is cheap and accessible. Saudi oil fields are 280 kilometers long, 100 meters deep, and account for about 50% of the country's total oil production. This makes Saudi Arabia the second largest oil producer and the top oil exporter in the world. Yet Saudi Arabia produces far less than it could. Throughout 2020, Saudi Arabia actually cut production due to logistics problems and the conflict in Ukraine. The state oil company, Saudi Aramco, reported an insane profit of $161 billion. A staggering sum, but that is precisely Saudi Arabia's biggest problem. Saudi Arabia is heavily dependent on oil. About 40% of their real GDP, 70% of exports, and around 75% of government revenue come from oil production. Their welfare is tied to the global oil market. Saudi Arabia has no income tax and an unusual labor structure where a third of the population works under contract, mostly foreigners, and more than half of Saudi nationals work for the government. The country relies entirely on how much oil money comes into their accounts. Imagine they can extract a barrel of oil for about $4 and sell it for $80. That's a profit of $76 per barrel. This is called oil rent. Essentially, Saudi Arabia has a rentier economy. So, despite the world's efforts to reduce oil dependence, the country is doing two seemingly odd things. First, they're expanding their oil and gas production, refining, and export capabilities, tapping into untapped reserves. Second, despite high oil prices in the early 2020s, they aren't rushing to spend the enormous profits they're making. Instead, they are heavily investing. Why? Because if they don't, the world might forget about them. They can't just rely on sand and camels, so they need to move quickly. What's their plan? It's incredibly ambitious. They want to reinvent the country. By 2030, Saudi Arabia aims to have a diversified, non-oil economy, be at the forefront of technology, and have one of the best education systems in the world. The country is pouring billions into solar and wind projects and plans to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. They are also investing in desalination plants and agriculture. And guess what? It's working. They aim to become a regional hub for finance and logistics, with fintech advancements in cities like Riyadh and Jeddah. They are investing in everything related to science, AI, flying cars, and the Saudi Genome Project. They're spending huge amounts on new housing developments across the country. And in their new green capital, Riyadh, they're offering huge sums for anything produced locally. Right now, it's mostly petrochemicals. They are also investing in tourism. What do you need to attract tourists? You need something massive and unique, like the Jeddah Tower, expected to be the tallest building in the world. Or Trojena, a futuristic desert ski resort. Or the Muqab, a 400-meter-tall cube that will house a sustainable mini-city. Then there's Qiddiya, an adrenaline paradise offering everything from water parks to racetracks, sports, and even esports stadiums. And of course, there's The Line, a 170-kilometer-long linear city. It's all pretty amazing. Why are they doing this? Because they want the 100 million tourists they hope to attract annually by 2030 to account for 10% of their GDP. They also want 1 million Saudis to be employed in these massive projects. Sure, Saudi Arabia already has a booming tourism sector, but it's mostly focused on Mecca, which every Muslim is encouraged to visit at least once in their lifetime. This is all incredibly complex and expensive, and yes, it is. But now it's clear how Saudi Arabia plans to reduce its dependence on oil. The Crown Prince has stated that Saudi Arabia suffers from oil addiction, and the country's main goal is to diversify its economy to shield itself from any future oil crises. Reducing oil dependence is crucial for both the nation's security and its economic growth. But at what cost? Well, it's not cheap. We're talking trillions, yes, trillions, of dollars. Specifically, they plan to create more than 500,000 public sector jobs. But there's a catch. Public sector jobs, mostly given to Saudi citizens at birth, are still subsidized by oil revenue, exactly what they're trying to move away from. They need to grow the private sector, which is expanding rapidly and is quite profitable. The problem is that it's hard to tell which industries are actually viable because they have so much money that everything looks profitable. Take, for example, Lucid Motors, the first car manufacturer in Saudi Arabia, producing luxury electric vehicles. The company is 60% owned by the country's national oil fund. And across the nation, about 80% of non-oil growth in the last 5 years has come from oil money. So, the country is still far from true financial independence from oil. The kingdom is in a tough spot. If they don't invest in private business, Saudi workers have no incentive to give up their oil rent cushy government jobs. But if they do invest, they become even more reliant on oil revenues, which flow into everyone's pockets because that's how their economy is structured. So, the Crown Prince needs something more to solve this dilemma. Enter the Public Investment Fund, PIF, one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world. Ironically, this well-funded institution might just be their ticket out of a rentier economy. It's a diversified portfolio, investing in everything from Uber to Nintendo, managing assets worth over $700 billion and nearing $1 trillion. It's one of the main tools Prince Salman is using to transition Saudi Arabia away from oil dependence. The concept is relatively simple. Instead of the government being at the mercy of fluctuating oil prices and quotas, they funnel a large portion of the profits into this fund, manage the money, let it grow, and only then spend it. This way, money flows into the budget regardless of current oil prices. It's the best way to spend oil rent on critical infrastructure, healthcare, and education. The Saudi royal family is one of the largest domestic and international investors. Anytime a major new tech company emerges, they're already involved. Video game companies? They're in. Electric cars? They've got the money. Recently, their fund financed an entirely new airport and airline. But do you know where else Saudi money goes? Billions of Saudi oil dollars have poured into international sports. The fund bought Newcastle United, owns 4 Saudi Pro League clubs, and manages 3 of the biggest professional golf leagues. They signed Ronaldo to a $200 million contract to play for Al Nassr. They're hosting the 2027 Asian Cup, the 2034 FIFA World Cup, and the 2029 Winter Asian Games. Yes, Winter Games in Saudi Arabia, it's mind-blowing. They've also poured huge sums into international tennis, boxing, cricket, MMA, motorsports, and horse racing. Why? Is it to foster a love of sports among their people? Not really. You can't force a country to suddenly love a sport that lacks cultural roots. There's a different reason. If these sports investments boost the country's GDP by even 1%, they'll continue to invest. It's the same with other massive projects they're planning. They have to be funded by the Public Investment Fund, PIF, or they'd never get built. They're spending all this money to attract 10 million tourists who will bring tens of billions of dollars into the country. But what's the real purpose of these wild investments? What good is building a giant cube or signing Ronaldo? It seems like a strange strategy for economic growth, doesn't it? Not at all. One reason is branding. Brand power is crucial, whether for a company or a country. Right now, Saudi Arabia doesn't have the best global image. Here's what most people think about Saudi Arabia: it's a country with a lot of oil. But it's definitely not a place, like Paris or Rome, that everyone dreams of visiting. So, if branding doesn't matter for countries, why do millions of people who have never been to Canada dream of moving there? Because Canada has built a brand of being a safe, open, and wealthy country. Whether it's true or not doesn't matter, that's the brand they sell to the world, and it works. If Saudi Arabia can sell its brand as a luxury and innovation hub, it could impact its ability to do business with foreigners, attract them, and keep the name Saudi Arabia top of mind for everyone. Another reason, the traditional way of life is being disrupted in this shifting economic landscape. Most Saudi citizens either directly benefited from oil production or received subsidies and social benefits funded by oil. This gave the royal family absolute control over politics, social habits, and much of the economy. But now that the government is openly stating its desire to move away from oil dependency, what happens to this social contract? They're simply creating a new one, either through rent payments from major sports enterprises or through branding and the scale of new developments. Look at most of these new projects, like tourism and video games. They're clearly aimed at a young audience that craves excitement. If they can find it without leaving their own country, that's a win. The government is also gradually loosening strict laws. Women can now drive, cinemas are open, music can play loudly in public, and even alcohol is now allowed, though only for diplomats and non-Muslims. Here's the key to any successful economy: an educated population and a highly skilled workforce. That's another challenge for Saudi Arabia. Saudi citizens find easy work in the public sector and live comfortable lives with their wealth. The average Saudi earns about the same as the average Canadian but is less educated than the average person in Gabon. That's great for them, but it's not acceptable for a successful country. 95% of public sector employees are Saudi citizens, but citizens only make up about 17% of private sector workers. The rest are foreign contract workers. This is why Saudi Arabia's demographics are so male-focused. Men dominate the workforce. So, the drive to create a new Saudi Arabia isn't just about branding, it's about pushing citizens to work in highly skilled fields. But can they actually develop these skills by throwing endless amounts of money into certain industries and hoping something innovative comes of it? That's still a big question. Saudi Arabia needs some way to measure how well its AI, electric vehicles, or petrochemical industries perform without government support. Their spending between the public and private sectors is already about 3 times the global average. And with their current employment structure, it would be extremely difficult to start taxing individuals as the primary source of government revenue, moving away from a lifestyle of wealthy complacency. By 2030, or more likely, sometime after 2030, this will require sacrifices from citizens, to put it mildly. They'll have to step out of their comfort zone. But the kingdom is reluctant to do that. They still remember the wave of uprisings that swept across Arab countries in the early 2010s, toppling 4 governments in the process. However, if Saudi Arabia can become a highly skilled, high-productivity country, this program will pay off. They might even become one of the first economies to escape the oil curse. Will Saudi Arabia break its dependence on oil rent? It's still unclear. One thing is for sure, the world is becoming less dependent on the US dollar, and Saudi Arabia's decisions reflect that. How much will the financial system change, and what's the future of the dollar? Share your thoughts in the comments.